Some nights, the silence where her laughter used to be is so loud it keeps Thomas Bennett awake until dawn. Every morning, he stares at the empty side of the bed and wonders how he'll find the strength to face another day without Sarah, especially with two young children who still ask when Mommy is coming home. 6 months after burying his wife, Thomas is drowning in debt and barely keeping the family farm running. When Sarah's uncle dies and leaves him an old, worthless farm that hasn't been worked in decades, it feels like one more burden on his breaking shoulders. The buildings are falling apart, the land is overgrown, and everyone in town calls it hopeless. But while clearing debris from an old stone well, Thomas makes a discovery that changes everything. Hidden beneath years of neglect lies something worth $43 million. This windfall should solve all his problems, but it brings new dangers he never expected. Will this blessing become his family's salvation or their greatest threat? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The alarm clock's harsh buzz cuts through the pre-dawn darkness at 5:30, just as it has every morning for the past 6 months. Thomas Bennett reaches across the bed to silence it, his hand briefly touching the cold space where Sarah used to sleep. The small gesture has become routine, a painful reminder that starts each day with a fresh wound. He sits on the edge of the bed for a moment, running his calloused hands through graying hair that seems to have aged years in these few months. At 42, Thomas looks older than his years now, the weight of grief and responsibility etched in the lines around his eyes. Sarah's recipe box sits on the dresser across from him, its faded blue paint and brass corners catching the dim light from the hallway. Inside, her handwritten cards hold the secrets to Sunday pot roasts, birthday cakes, and the special pancakes she made when the children were sad. The box represents everything he struggles to maintain alone, the warmth, the traditions, the sense of home that came so naturally to her. The house feels different without her presence. Where once there was the sound of Sarah humming while making coffee, now there's only the mechanical drip of the automatic pot he finally learned to program. The kitchen that was once the heart of their home, filled with the aroma of fresh bread and Sarah's gentle laughter, now feels hollow and too large for just him and the children. 8-year-old Emma appears in the doorway, her blonde hair tousled from sleep. She looks so much like her mother that sometimes Thomas has to catch his breath. "Daddy!" Jake wet the bed again. She says, matter-of-factly, though her eyes hold a concern far too mature for her age. Thomas nods and rises, grateful for the immediate task that pulls him from his thoughts. "I'll take care of it, sweetheart. Can you start getting ready for school?" Emma nods solemnly. Since Sarah's death, she's taken on responsibilities that no 8-year-old should bear, helping with her 5-year-old brother Jake and trying to fill the maternal void in small ways. Thomas sees how she watches him, checking to make sure he's holding together, and his heart breaks for the childhood she's losing. 5-year-old Jake is still learning to process his mother's absence. Some days he seems fine, playing with his toy tractors and helping Thomas with small farm chores. Other days, he asks when Mommy is coming back from heaven or why she can't just visit like Grandpa does. Thomas has learned to keep tissues in every room. After changing Jake's sheets and getting both children ready for school, Thomas drives them into town in his aging pickup truck. The 20-minute ride to Millbrook Elementary gives him time to appreciate the rolling Nebraska landscape that's been his world for nearly 2 decades. The cornfields stretch endlessly under the gray October sky, most already harvested, leaving behind stubble that catches the morning frost. The Bennett farm spans 300 acres that Thomas inherited from his father, just as his father had inherited it from his grandfather. For 3 generations, the land had sustained the family, providing a modest but honest living. Now, with Sarah gone and medical bills mounting from her long battle with cancer, the farm feels more like a burden than a blessing. Sarah had been the one who managed the books, who negotiated with suppliers, who knew exactly when to plant and when to sell. She had an intuitive understanding of the land that Thomas admired but could never quite replicate. Without her guidance, he's made several costly mistakes this season, planting too late, harvesting too early, missing opportunities that she would have seen clearly. The medical bills from Sarah's 2-year fight against cancer sit in a manila folder on the kitchen counter, a stack of papers that grows thicker each week as late fees accumulate. The insurance covered most of the major treatments, but the small costs added up gas for the 3-hour drives to the cancer center in Omaha, hotel stays during her treatments, the special foods she could tolerate during chemotherapy, the home care equipment. Thomas had gladly spent every penny they had and borrowed against the farm to give her every possible chance. But those decisions now haunt his sleepless nights. At Millbrook Elementary, Thomas watches Emma walk Jake to his kindergarten classroom before heading to her own 3rd-grade room. She holds his hand and speaks to him softly, a miniature mother figure that makes Thomas's chest tighten. Other parents nod to him with sympathetic smiles, and he appreciates their kindness even as he wishes he could be invisible. The pitying looks remind him daily of his loss and his struggles. Back at the farm, Thomas begins his morning chores. The dairy cows need milking, though the herd has shrunk from 25 head to just 12, as he's been forced to sell cattle to pay bills. Each cow represents income, and each one sold feels like another step backward. The milk truck comes 3 times a week to collect what little he produces, and Thomas knows the driver has been instructed to monitor the quality carefully. One bad batch could end his contract with the dairy cooperative. The equipment barn tells the story of a farm in decline. The John Deere tractor that should have been replaced 5 years ago now requires constant repairs that Thomas performs himself with help from YouTube videos and borrowed tools. The harvester sits idle with a broken transmission that would cost more to fix than Thomas could earn from an entire crop. He's been borrowing equipment from neighbors, trading labor for the use of their machines, arrangement that works but leaves him feeling dependent and behind schedule. Thomas's closest friend and neighbor, Pete Morrison, stops by around 10 o'clock, as he often does. Pete's farm borders the Bennett property to the east, and he's been more brother than friend since Sarah's death. A weathered man in his 50s with kind eyes and steady hands, Pete has his own challenges, but always makes time to help. "Coffee's on if you want some," Thomas calls from the barn as Pete's truck pulls up. "That'd be good." Pete joins him in the milking parlor, watching Thomas work. "You look tired." "Every day." Thomas doesn't look up from connecting the milking machine. Jake had another rough night. Kids take time to adjust. Hell, adults take time to adjust. Pete leans against the rail, comfortable in the silence that follows. Both men understand grief in their own ways. Pete lost his first wife in a car accident 15 years ago, though he's since remarried. "Got a notice from the bank yesterday," Thomas says finally. "They want to discuss restructuring the loan." Pete's expression tightens. "How far behind?" 3 months on the mortgage, 2 on the equipment loan. Thomas's voice stays steady, but his hands work faster. "I can probably scrape together enough to get current, but then I'm back to square one next month." "You thought about selling some land?" Thomas has thought about it constantly. The farm's back, 40 acres border the main road into town, making them valuable for development. A shopping center or housing subdivision could pay enough to clear his debts and set up a college fund for the children. But selling land feels like betraying his family's legacy, like admitting defeat. "Sarah made me promise to keep the farm in the family," Thomas says. "She said it was the children's inheritance, their connection to something bigger than themselves." Pete nods, understanding the weight of such a promise. She was right, but she also would have wanted you and the kids to survive. Sometimes keeping a promise means finding a different way to honor it. After Pete leaves, Thomas spends the afternoon repairing fence posts along the property line. The physical work helps clear his mind, and the repetitive motion of setting posts and stringing wire provides a meditation of sorts. The October air carries the scent of dying leaves and the distant smoke from someone burning brush piles, familiar autumn smells that connect him to childhood memories of helping his father with the same tasks. As he works, Thomas thinks about the early years of his marriage. He'd met Sarah at the county fair when they were both 19. She was visiting from the city with college friends, and he was showing his prize heifer in the livestock competition. Something about her genuine interest in farm life, her questions about the animals and crops, drew him immediately. She wasn't pretending to care. She actually wanted to understand his world. Their courtship lasted 2 years, with Sarah making regular trips to the farm and Thomas occasionally venturing into the city to see her. When she agreed to marry him and move to the farm permanently, Thomas felt like he'd won the lottery. Sarah brought intelligence, warmth, and business sense to their partnership. She learned to milk cows, tend chickens, and manage the financial side of farming with an enthusiasm that never dimmed. The children came along naturally, Emma first, then Jake 3 years later. Sarah balanced motherhood with farm duties, involving the children in age-appropriate chores and teaching them to love the land as she had learned to love it. She made the farm feel like more than a business. It was a way of life, a legacy worth preserving. Now, standing alone in the field as the sun begins to set, Thomas feels the full weight of carrying on without her. Every decision feels momentous, every mistake potentially catastrophic. The children depend on him not just for food and shelter, but for stability, for hope, for the kind of nurturing presence that Sarah provided so naturally. The sound of the school bus brings him back to the present. Emma and Jake will be getting off at the end of the driveway, and they'll want snacks and help with homework. Jake will probably want to play with his toy tractors while Thomas prepares dinner, and Emma will quietly observe everything, ready to help wherever she's needed. As he walks back toward the house, Thomas catches sight of Sarah's recipe box through the kitchen window, still sitting on the counter where he'd placed it that morning. Tonight, maybe he'll try to make her cornbread recipe for dinner. The children always smile when he attempts her cooking, even when it doesn't turn out quite right. Those small moments of connection to their mother feel precious, worth the extra effort and inevitable imperfection. The daily routine continues: dinner, homework, baths, bedtime stories, but underneath it all runs the constant current of worry about money, about the future, about whether he's enough for these children who have already lost so much. Thomas knows he can't replace their mother, but he's determined to be the father they need, even if he's still learning how to do it alone. The phone call comes on a Tuesday morning while Thomas is trying to fix the kitchen faucet that's been dripping for 3 weeks. Emma and Jake are at school, and the house feels too quiet except for the persistent sound of water hitting the stainless steel sink. When the phone rings, Thomas wipes his hands on an old dish rag and glances at the caller ID: Jameson, Associates, Attorneys at Law. Mr. Bennett, this is Margaret Jameson. I represented your wife's uncle, Harold Whitfield. I'm sorry to be calling with sad news, but Mr. Whitfield passed away last Thursday. Thomas sits heavily in Sarah's chair at the kitchen table. Uncle Harold had been a fixture in Sarah's life, though Thomas had only met him a handful of times. A bachelor who'd lived alone on a remote property 30 miles north of Millbrook, Harold had visited for holidays and birthday parties, but remained somewhat mysterious. Sarah had been fond of him, speaking often of childhood summers spent at his farm before her parents moved to the city. I'm sorry to hear that, Thomas says, though he feels emotionally numb to any loss that isn't Sarah herself. Mr. Whitfield left specific instructions in his will. He's bequeathed his entire property to you, Mr. Bennett, the farmhouse, outbuildings, and 160 acres. There's also this letter he asked me to give you personally. An hour later, Thomas sits in the lawyer's wood-paneled office, staring at an envelope with his name written in Harold's distinctive handwriting. Margaret Jameson, a woman in her 60s with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, watches him with professional sympathy. The property hasn't been actively farmed in over 20 years, she explains. Harold was quite elderly and had been living very simply. I should mention that there are some back taxes owed about $8,000, but nothing that would prevent you from taking possession. Thomas turns the envelope over in his hands. Uncle Harold's last letter feels heavier than paper should, as if it contains more than words. Did he say why he left it to me instead of other family members? He specifically mentioned that you'd understand the value of the land, that you'd respect what it represented. He seemed to believe you were the right person to care for it properly. The drive to Harold's property takes Thomas through countryside he remembers from childhood visits with Sarah. The land becomes hillier and more wooded as he drives north, with fewer farms and more untamed areas. When he turns down the gravel road marked by a faded mailbox reading Whitfield, Thomas feels like he's entering a different world. The farmhouse appears through a grove of oak trees, and Thomas's heart sinks. The two-story White House, which he remembers as neat and welcoming, now looks abandoned. Shutters hang askew, paint peels from the siding, and several porch boards have rotted through. The barn leans dangerously to one side, its red paint faded to rust brown, and the chicken coop has partially collapsed. Thomas parks and sits in his truck for a moment, overwhelmed by the scale of neglect. This isn't an inheritance, it's a financial disaster waiting to happen. The back taxes alone would strain his already tight budget, and the cost of basic repairs would be astronomical. He thinks about Emma and Jake, about the promises he's already struggling to keep, and wonders how he can possibly take on another burden. But something draws him from the truck anyway. Perhaps the memory of Sarah's stories about this place, or maybe just the need to understand what Harold saw in him. The October wind rustles through the oak leaves as Thomas approaches the house, and despite its condition, he can see the bones of something beautiful underneath the decay. The front porch creaks under his weight but holds firm. Through a gap in the boarded-up windows, Thomas can see into what was once a comfortable living room. Dust covers everything like a grey shroud, but he can make out a stone fireplace, built-in bookshelves, and the kind of solid craftsmanship that doesn't exist in modern construction. Behind the house, Thomas discovers what might once have been an impressive garden. Stone pathways wind between overgrown beds, where perennials struggle to survive among the weeds. A grape arbor, heavy with unpruned vines, creates a tunnel, leading to what appears to be an old root cellar or storm shelter built into a hillside. As he explores further, Thomas begins to notice unusual features that suggest Harold had been more than just a simple farmer. Stone walls appear in unexpected places, clearly built with skill and purpose, but for reasons that aren't immediately obvious. The barn, despite its decrepit exterior, shows signs of being modified with reinforced sections and what might be hidden rooms. Near the edge of the wooded area, Thomas discovers something that makes him pause. Partially hidden by brush and fallen branches is an old stone well, its opening covered by a thick slab of carved limestone. The craftsmanship is extraordinary. The stone cover features intricate symbols and patterns that don't match anything Thomas has seen in rural Nebraska architecture. The well itself appears much older than the house, possibly predating European settlement in the area. As the afternoon grows late, Thomas reluctantly returns to his truck. He needs to pick up the children from school, help with homework, prepare dinner. The routine of single parenthood calls him back to the present, but his mind stays focused on the mysteries he's discovered. Harold's property feels like a puzzle with missing pieces, and despite the obvious financial burden it represents, Thomas finds himself intrigued rather than simply overwhelmed. That evening, after Emma and Jake are asleep, Thomas finally opens Uncle Harold's letter. The envelope contains two items: a single sheet of paper with Harold's careful handwriting and an old brass key attached to a piece of leather cord. "Thomas," the letter begins, "if you're reading this, then I've passed on, and you've inherited more than you realize. This property has been in Sarah's family for generations, though not all of our history is written in courthouse records. Your wife knew some of our family's story, but not all of it. She understood the importance of keeping certain things safe, of preserving what others might not value properly. The land you've inherited served as a station on the Underground Railroad. My great-grandfather, Sarah's great-great-grandfather, was one of the conductors who helped freedom seekers find their way north. The modifications you'll discover on the property weren't made for farming. They were made for hiding people and protecting precious things. I've watched you these past few years, seen how you love the land and respect its history. Sarah spoke often of your integrity, of your commitment to doing what's right, even when it's difficult. That's why I've entrusted this legacy to you, rather than to others who might see only dollar signs. The key opens what you need to find. Look beneath the surface, Thomas. Sometimes what appears worthless holds the greatest treasure. Take care of what I've preserved, and it will take care of you and the children. Your friend in both life and death, Harold Whitfield. Thomas reads the letter 3 times, each reading raising more questions than answers. Harold's words suggest the property holds secrets beyond its obvious historical significance. But what kind of secrets would an elderly bachelor preserve on a failing farm? And what role had Sarah played in whatever family legacy Harold was describing? The brass key feels warm in Thomas's palm, worn smooth by years of handling. It's clearly old, possibly antique, with markings that might be symbols or simply wear patterns. Looking at it, Thomas feels a sense of responsibility settling over him like a familiar coat. Harold had trusted him with something important, something connected to Sarah's family history and possibly to the future Thomas is trying to build for his children. Outside, the October wind rattles the windows of the Bennett farmhouse, and Thomas makes a decision that will change everything. Tomorrow, after the children are in school, he'll return to Harold's property with tools and determination. Whatever secrets the old farm holds, whatever Harold preserved there, Thomas will uncover them and honor both his wife's memory and her uncle's trust. The letter and key go into the drawer with Sarah's recipe box, joining the collection of precious things that connect Thomas to his past and guide him toward an uncertain but suddenly more hopeful future. Thomas returns to Harold's property the next morning with his truck loaded with tools, work gloves, and a thermos of coffee that tastes nothing like Sarah's but serves its purpose. The October air carries the crisp promise of winter, and the oak trees surrounding the farmhouse have begun their transformation to gold and amber. In daylight, the property's neglect seems both more obvious and more manageable. He decides to start with the stone well that had captured his attention the day before. The old stone well cover, with its intricate carvings and mysterious symbols, seems like the logical place to begin unraveling Harold's puzzle. The brass key Harold left him weighs heavy in his pocket, though he hasn't yet discovered what lock it opens. Clearing the brush around the well proves more challenging than expected. Years of growth have created a tangle of wild grapevines, sumac bushes, and volunteer trees that seem determined to hide the structure. As Thomas works, pulling away layers of vegetation, he begins to appreciate the well's true size and craftsmanship. The stone walls extend much deeper than typical farm wells, and the limestone blocks show the kind of precise fitting usually found in much older, more significant structures. The carved cover itself is remarkable. As Thomas clears away dirt and moss, symbols emerge that look almost Celtic in their complexity: spirals, interwoven lines, and what might be letters in a script he doesn't recognize. In the center, a circular depression suggests that something once fit there, perhaps a key or medallion that would complete the design. Pete Morrison arrives around 10 o'clock, just as Thomas is attempting to lever one corner of the heavy stone cover. "Thought you might need a hand," Pete calls out, approaching with his own set of tools. "This thing weighs more than a newborn calf," Thomas says, grateful for the help. Harold's letter mentioned looking beneath the surface. I'm starting to think he meant it literally. Together, the two men manage to shift the massive stone cover enough to peer into the well below. What they discover defies expectations. Instead of the typical stone-lined shaft leading to a water table, they find themselves looking down into what appears to be a carefully constructed chamber. Stone steps spiral down along the walls, disappearing into darkness that their flashlights can't fully penetrate. "That's not a well," Pete says, stating the obvious with characteristic understatement. "No, it's not." Thomas plays his flashlight beam across the carved symbols on the cover again. Harold's letter mentioned the Underground Railroad. Maybe this was part of that system. They spend the next hour carefully moving the stone cover completely aside, revealing the full opening. The craftsmanship below ground matches what they've seen above: precisely cut limestone blocks, expertly fitted joints, and construction that has stood solid for what might be more than a century. The spiral staircase, worn smooth by countless feet, descends about 12 feet before opening into what appears to be a larger chamber. Thomas goes down first, testing each stone step carefully. The air below is surprisingly dry and cool, with none of the musty dampness he'd expected. His flashlight reveals a circular room, about 15 feet in diameter, with walls lined in the same carefully fitted limestone. Carved niches around the walls might once have held oil lamps or candles, and the floor shows wear patterns, suggesting heavy use over many years. But it's what's hidden behind a false wall section that makes Thomas catch his breath. Harold's brass key fits perfectly into a small lock mechanism concealed among the carved decorations. When Thomas turns the key, a section of the wall swings inward on well-oiled hinges, revealing a smaller chamber beyond. "Thomas, you all right down there?" Pete's voice echoes from above. "You need to see this," Thomas calls back, his voice tight with amazement. The hidden chamber contains what can only be described as a treasure room. Wooden boxes and metal containers line shelves carved into the rock walls. Some containers appear old enough to be antiques, others more recent. Thomas's flashlight beam catches the glint of precious metals, the dull sheen of old documents in protective wrapping, and items whose value he can't immediately assess. Pete joins him in the chamber, whistling low at the sight. Harold was holding on to more than memories. Thomas approaches the nearest shelf with reverent care. A wooden box, clearly handmade with dovetailed joints and brass hardware, contains what appear to be gold coins, some American, others foreign, all obviously old and potentially valuable. Another container holds rolled documents that might be historical papers or legal instruments. A third contains jewelry that, even to Thomas's untrained eye, looks significant pieces that might have been family heirlooms or items entrusted to Harold's care. This explains why he was so careful about who inherited the property, Thomas says, running his fingers along the edge of a particularly ornate silver serving piece. This isn't just family wealth, it's history. They spend an hour cataloguing what they can see without disturbing anything. The collection appears to represent generations of accumulated valuables, possibly items saved by families escaping slavery, or treasures preserved by conductors on the Underground Railroad who never saw their owners again. Some pieces clearly date to the Civil War era, others appear more recent, as if Harold had continued the tradition of safeguarding precious things for people who needed protection. As they prepare to leave the chamber, Thomas notices something that stops him cold. Tucked among the historical artifacts is a manila envelope with his name written in Sarah's handwriting. Inside, he finds a letter in her familiar script, dated just 3 months before her death. "My dearest Thomas," the letter begins, "if you're reading this, then Uncle Harold has passed away, and you've discovered what our family has protected for so many generations. I wanted to tell you about this while I was still alive, but Harold made me promise to let him decide when the time was right. Now that you've found our secret, I can explain what it means and why it's so important. The treasure you've discovered isn't just valuable, it represents the savings and precious belongings of dozens of families who passed through this station on their way to freedom. Some items were left as payment for help received. Others were entrusted to our family's care when people feared they might not survive their journey. Harold spent his entire life being the guardian of these things, keeping them safe, occasionally selling pieces when descendants could be found and reunited with their inheritance. But there's more, Thomas. Hidden among the historical artifacts are investments Harold made over the decades: gold, silver, rare coins, and bonds that have grown in value beyond what anyone could have imagined. The total worth of everything in that chamber is more than enough to secure our children's future and preserve this historical site for generations to come. I know this discovery comes with responsibility. These aren't just treasures, they're trust. Harold chose you because he knew you'd understand the difference. Use what you need to take care of Emma and Jake, but preserve what you can for the families these items really belong to. The Historical Society in Lincoln has records that might help you reunite some pieces with descendants of the original owners. I love you, Thomas. I always have, and I always will. Take care of our babies, and let this gift help you give them the future we always dreamed they'd have. Thomas reads the letter twice before sharing it with Pete, who listens with the gravity the moment deserves. Outside, the October sun has moved across the sky, reminding them that children will soon be coming home from school and normal life will resume its demands. But nothing will be quite normal again. Thomas Bennett, struggling widowed farmer, has become the guardian of a treasure that could solve his financial problems and honor a historical legacy that stretches back generations. The responsibility feels overwhelming, but for the first time since Sarah's death, he also feels something like hope stirring in his chest. As they carefully seal the chamber and replace the stone cover, Thomas knows that tomorrow will bring new challenges. He'll need to research the legal implications of his discovery, find experts who can properly evaluate the collection, and decide how to balance his family's needs against his obligation to preserve history. But tonight, he'll go home to Emma and Jake with the knowledge that their future has just become infinitely more secure, and that Sarah's love continues to provide for them, even from beyond the grave. The next week passes in a blur of research and careful planning. Thomas knows he needs expert guidance to properly handle his discovery, but Harold's letter and Sarah's instructions emphasize discretion. The wrong person learning about the treasure could bring complications he's not prepared to handle. Instead of rushing to publicize his find, Thomas begins a methodical investigation into the property's history and the legal implications of his inheritance. His first stop is the Millbrook Historical Society, housed in a converted Victorian mansion on Main Street. Dorothy Fleming, the Society's elderly director, greets him with the enthusiasm of someone who rarely receives visitors interested in local history. "Harold Whitfield's property," she says, adjusting her glasses as she considers his request. "Oh my, yes, that land has quite a story. Let me pull our files." What Dorothy shows him exceeds his expectations. The historical land survey map she produces, dated 1890, reveals details about the property that even Harold's letter hadn't fully explained. The original land grant shows the property was purchased not by a single family, but by a group of abolitionists working together to establish what the map euphemistically calls a way station for travelers. The Whitfield family were prominent conductors on the Underground Railroad, Dorothy explains, spreading the survey map across her desk. This area of Nebraska was a crucial link between Kansas and Iowa, and your property, well, Harold's property, now yours, was one of the most important safe houses in the region. The map shows details that make Thomas's pulse quicken. The well he discovered is clearly marked, labeled simply as Access Point. Other features on the property, the modified barn, the unusual stone walls, the root cellar, are all indicated with symbols that suggest they served purposes beyond normal farm operations. According to our records, Dorothy continues, the Whitfield station helped more than 200 people reach freedom between 1855 and 1865. After the Civil War, the family continued to serve as a resource for former slaves seeking to establish new lives in the North. Dorothy also produces photographs from the early 1900s showing the property in its prime. The farmhouse, barn, and outbuildings were clearly prosperous and well-maintained, suggesting that the Underground Railroad activities had been financially supported by the community. Thomas realizes that Harold's inheritance includes not just hidden treasure, but a piece of American history that deserves preservation and recognition. Have other researchers been interested in the property? Thomas asks, thinking about the need for discretion. Dorothy's expression grows thoughtful. Actually, yes. About 6 months ago, a development company sent representatives asking about historical designations and any restrictions that might affect commercial development. They seemed particularly interested in mineral rights and what they called archaeological potential. Thomas feels a chill. 6 months ago, Sarah was still alive but already very ill. Had someone known about the treasure even then? Had they been waiting for Harold to die to make their move? Do you remember the name of the company? Blackwood Development, I believe. They left business cards and asked me to call if I learned anything new about the property's history. The name means nothing to Thomas, but he makes a mental note to research Blackwood Development and their interest in Harold's land. Dorothy provides him with copies of the historical documents and promises to search her archives for any additional information about the property's Underground Railroad activities. That afternoon, Thomas drives to Lincoln to meet with Dr. Michael Harrison, a professor of African American history at the University of Nebraska. Thomas had found Dr. Harrison's name in Dorothy's files. He'd been researching Underground Railroad sites throughout the state and had corresponded with Harold occasionally over the years. Dr. Harrison, a distinguished man in his 60s with kind eyes and an obvious passion for his subject, listens intently as Thomas explains his inheritance and discovery. When Thomas mentions the treasure chamber, Dr. Harrison's excitement is immediate and genuine. Mr. Bennett, what you've discovered could be one of the most significant Underground Railroad archaeological finds in the Midwest. Dr. Harrison says, the fact that artifacts have been preserved in their original context makes this invaluable for historical research. Dr. Harrison explains that many Underground Railroad sites have been lost to development or natural deterioration. Those that survive often contain only structural elements, the hiding places, secret rooms, and modified buildings that served the cause. To find a site where personal artifacts and valuable items have been preserved offers a unique window into the lives of the people who risked everything for freedom. However, Dr. Harrison continues, you need to be very careful about how you proceed. Sites like this have attracted the wrong kind of attention in the past. There are people who see only monetary value, not historical significance. Thomas shares Dorothy's information about Blackwood Development, and Dr. Harrison's expression grows concerned. I've heard that name before, unfortunately. They've been involved in several controversial development projects where historical sites mysteriously lost their protected status just before being purchased and developed. Dr. Harrison offers to help Thomas navigate the complex legal and ethical issues surrounding his discovery. He suggests involving the State Historical Society and possibly the National Park Service to ensure the site receives proper protection and recognition. He also recommends consulting with genealogical experts who specialize in African American family history. They might be able to help identify original owners of some artifacts and reunite families with ancestral possessions. The most important thing, Dr. Harrison emphasizes, is to document everything carefully before making any decisions about the artifacts. Each item could tell a story, and those stories are part of America's heritage. Thomas drives home that evening with his head spinning from information and possibility. The treasure he discovered represents not just financial security for his family, but historical responsibility that extends far beyond his personal needs. Sarah's letter had prepared him for this, but actually facing the implications feels overwhelming. That night, after Emma and Jake are in bed, Thomas sits at the kitchen table with Harold's letter, Sarah's letter, and the documents from the Historical Society spread before him. The brass key rests in his palm, warm and somehow heavier than when he first held it. Looking at everything together, Thomas begins to understand the full scope of what Harold and Sarah had entrusted to him. The property isn't just land, it's a monument to human courage and compassion. The treasure isn't just valuable objects, it's the tangible remains of dreams and hopes carried by people fleeing slavery. The responsibility isn't just financial, it's moral and historical. But Thomas also recognizes that preserving history requires resources, and Blackwood Development's interest suggests that others see profit potential in the property. He needs to move carefully but decisively to protect both his family's future and the historical legacy Harold preserved. Tomorrow, he'll begin the process of having the artifacts professionally evaluated and documented. He'll research legal protections for historical sites and investigate Blackwood Development's background and intentions. Most importantly, he'll start making the connections between past and present that will allow him to honor both Harold's trust and Sarah's memory. The October wind rattles the windows of the Bennett farmhouse, but for the first time in months, Thomas feels like he's building something instead of just trying to hold together what's left. The discovery has given him more than treasure. It's given him purpose and direction when he desperately needed both. As he turns off the kitchen light and heads upstairs, Thomas catches sight of Sarah's recipe box on the counter, illuminated by moonlight streaming through the window. Tomorrow's challenges will be significant, but tonight he feels her presence in the decision to protect what matters most, and to ensure that their children inherit more than just money. They'll inherit a legacy of doing what's right, even when it's difficult. 3 weeks after the initial discovery, Thomas stands in the underground chamber with Dr. Rachel Martinez, a certified appraiser specializing in historical artifacts and Civil War-era valuables. Dr. Martinez, a meticulous woman in her 40s, examines each item with the reverence it deserves, while documenting everything with digital photography and detailed notes. "Mr. Bennett," she says, holding up the brass compass that had been tucked among the gold coins, "this is extraordinary. It's a military compass, probably Union Army issue, circa 1863. But look at these engravings along the edge." Thomas leans closer as Dr. Martinez points out tiny symbols carved into the brass surface. The engravings match some of the symbols they've found throughout the property on the stone well cover, carved into certain foundation stones, even etched discreetly into the barn's support beams. "These symbols appear to be a code system," Dr. Martinez explains. "Underground railroad conductors often used various methods to communicate safe routes and destinations. This compass doesn't just point north. These engravings suggest it was used to mark specific locations and pathways. As they work through the collection, the scope of the treasure becomes clear. Dr. Martinez's preliminary estimates suggest the total value approaches $43 million, though she emphasizes that some items are literally priceless from a historical perspective. "The gold coins alone are worth several million," she explains, photographing a particularly rare 1854 double eagle. But these documents, she indicates a collection of papers wrapped in oiled cloth, could be worth even more to historians and museums. They appear to be original correspondence between Underground Railroad conductors, route maps, and what might be the names of escaped slaves who passed through this station. The implications stagger Thomas. He's not just inherited wealth, he's become the guardian of documentation that could help thousands of descendants trace their family histories and understand how their ancestors achieved freedom. Dr. Martinez also confirms what Thomas has begun to suspect. The collection shows evidence of being actively maintained and expanded well into the 20th century. Some items clearly date to Harold's lifetime, suggesting he continued the family tradition of safeguarding valuable items for people who needed protection. Your wife's uncle appears to have been running what we might call a modern version of the Underground Railroad, Dr. Martinez observes, helping people preserve family treasures, assisting with documentation during difficult times, providing secure storage for items that needed protection. This wasn't just a historical site, it was an active service to the community. After Dr. Martinez completes her initial assessment and leaves, Thomas spends time alone in the chamber, trying to process the full weight of his responsibility. The brass compass rests in his palm, its worn surface warm from his touch. According to the engravings Dr. Martinez deciphered, the compass had belonged to Captain James Whitfield, Harold's great-grandfather, and Sarah's great-great-grandfather, the original conductor who established the station. The compass still works, its needle pointing steadily north toward freedom, just as it had guided desperate families more than a century and a half ago. But now Thomas wonders if it might point toward something else, another cache, another chamber, another part of Harold's carefully preserved legacy. That afternoon, Thomas decides to explore the property more systematically, using the compass and the historical survey map as guides. Emma and Jake help with the exploration, treating it like a treasure hunt game, while Thomas searches for clues about additional historical features. Near the tree line behind the collapsed chicken coop, the compass needle begins to behave strangely, spinning wildly before settling on a direction that's distinctly northwest rather than true north. Following this new heading, Thomas discovers what he initially takes for a natural rock formation, but realizes, upon closer inspection, is actually a carefully constructed stone foundation overgrown with decades of vegetation. Clearing away brush and soil reveals the remains of what might have been a small cabin or large storage building. The foundation stones show the same careful craftsmanship as the well chamber, and Thomas finds himself wondering if this might have been temporary housing for people traveling the Underground Railroad. "Daddy, look what I found!" Emma calls from the edge of the foundation. She's holding a piece of rusted metal that might once have been a cooking pot or tool. Jake, not to be outdone, begins digging in the soft earth near what might have been the building's entrance. "There's something hard here," he announces, his small hands pulling at something buried just below the surface. What Jake uncovers makes Thomas's breath catch. It's a small wooden box, badly weathered but intact, about the size of a jewelry box. The wood appears to be cedar, chosen for its resistance to insects and decay. When Thomas carefully opens the box, he finds it contains items that clearly belong to a child: a wooden toy horse, a small leather-bound book that might be a diary, and a locket containing a daguerreotype photograph of a young African-American woman. The discovery feels deeply personal in a way that even the treasure chamber hadn't. These aren't valuable artifacts, they're the cherished possessions of a child who passed through the station more than a century ago. Thomas imagines the desperation of parents who had to choose between carrying their child's treasures and traveling light enough to survive their dangerous journey. "We need to take special care of this," Thomas tells Emma and Jake, showing them the delicate items. "These belong to a little girl or boy who lived a long time ago, someone who had to leave their home to find freedom." Emma, with the solemnity that's become characteristic of her since Sarah's death, nods gravely. "Like the treasure Uncle Harold saved?" "Exactly like that. Our job is to keep these safe until we can find out more about the family they belong to." As the afternoon progresses, Thomas realizes that the compass continues to point toward additional locations around the property. Each spot reveals some trace of the Underground Railroad station's operations: buried metal objects that might have been tools or weapons, foundation stones from structures that no longer exist, even what appears to be the remains of a hidden trail leading through the woods toward the next safe house. The property isn't just a farm with a hidden treasure room. It's an entire network of historical sites that tell the story of one community's commitment to the cause of freedom. The compass, Thomas realizes, was designed to help conductors navigate not just geographic routes, but the specific features and hiding places that made their station effective. That evening, Thomas calls Dr. Harrison to report the day's discoveries. The professor's excitement is infectious, and he immediately begins making plans to bring a team of graduate students to help with a proper archaeological survey of the property. Mr. Bennett, what you've found could revolutionize our understanding of underground railroad operations in Nebraska, Dr. Harrison says. The preservation level is unprecedented, and the documentation potential is enormous. But Dr. Harrison also shares concerning news. His contacts in the State Historical Preservation Office have reported increased pressure from development interests to expedite reviews of properties in the area. Blackwood Development has apparently filed preliminary environmental impact studies for several parcels near Thomas's inherited property. They're moving faster than usual, Dr. Harrison warns. Whatever they're planning, they want to get approvals in place before anyone can raise historical preservation concerns. Thomas goes to bed that night with the brass compass on his nightstand, its presence somehow comforting despite the growing complexity of his situation. The compass represents more than historical artifact. It's become a symbol of guidance during uncertain times, a reminder that sometimes the right direction isn't the obvious one. Outside his window, the November wind carries the scent of coming winter, but Thomas feels a warmth he hasn't experienced since Sarah's death. The property Harold left him is more than valuable, it's meaningful. The responsibility is greater than he initially understood, but so is the potential for positive impact. Tomorrow he'll begin the process of working with Dr. Harrison and the State Historical Society to document the site properly and ensure its protection. Tonight, he allows himself to feel cautiously optimistic about the future he's building for Emma and Jake. A future rooted in historical significance and guided by the same moral compass that led their ancestors to do what was right, even when it was dangerous. The first sign of trouble comes on a grey November morning when Thomas finds a black SUV parked at the end of his driveway. Two men in expensive suits wait beside the vehicle, their presence incongruous against the rural landscape of bare fields and weathered fence posts. Thomas recognizes the calculated casualness of their posture. These aren't friendly neighbors or county officials making a social call. Mr. Bennett? The taller man approaches with a practiced smile and an extended hand. I'm Richard Blackwood, and this is my associate, Marcus Webb. We represent Blackwood Development Company. I wonder if we might have a few minutes of your time to discuss a business opportunity. Thomas shakes the offered hand but keeps his expression neutral. Dr. Harrison's warnings about this company echo in his mind as he studies the two men. Richard Blackwood appears to be in his 50s, with silver hair and the kind of confidence that comes from never hearing the word no. Marcus Webb is younger, perhaps 40, with sharp eyes that seem to catalogue every detail of the Bennett property, even as they speak. What kind of opportunity? Thomas asks, though he suspects he already knows. Blackwood's smile widens. We understand you've recently inherited property from Harold Whitfield. That's quite a windfall for someone in your situation. We'd like to make you an offer that could solve all your financial concerns immediately. The casual mention of Thomas's financial situation sends a chill down his spine. These men have done their homework, researching not just the property inheritance, but his personal circumstances. Thomas wonders what else they know. I'm not looking to sell, Thomas says simply. Of course not, Webb interjects smoothly. You've just inherited a piece of family history. We completely understand the sentimental value. But Mr. Bennett, sentiment doesn't pay medical bills or secure your children's future. The mention of his children makes Thomas's jaw tighten. I haven't discussed my family situation with anyone from your company. Blackwood waves a dismissive hand. Small communities, Mr. Bennett. Word travels. We know you've had some challenges since your wife's passing. Cancer is expensive, even with insurance. We're simply offering a solution that could eliminate those worries permanently. Webb produces a manila folder from his briefcase. We're prepared to offer $3.7 million for the Whitfield property, cash with a 30-day closing. That's significantly above market value for farmland in this area. Thomas doesn't reach for the folder. $3.7 million would indeed solve his immediate financial problems and secure Emma and Jake's future. But it's barely a fraction of what Dr. Martinez estimated the treasure chamber contains. More importantly, it would mean abandoning the historical legacy that Harold and Sarah entrusted to his care. The property isn't for sale, Thomas repeats. Blackwood's expression hardens almost imperceptibly. Mr. Bennett, I don't think you understand the full scope of your situation. That property has some significant issues, environmental concerns, potential archaeological restrictions, complex legal entanglements. We're offering to take all of those problems off your hands. What kind of environmental concerns? Webb opens another folder, this one thick with official-looking documents. Our preliminary surveys indicate possible groundwater contamination from old farming practices. The State Environmental Agency will likely require expensive remediation before any development can occur. There are also questions about mineral rights and subterranean features that could complicate any future use of the property. Thomas realizes they know about the underground chamber, though they're being careful not to mention it directly. The reference to subterranean features and archaeological restrictions suggests they've done more than casual research into Harold's property. How do you know about subterranean features? Thomas asks. Blackwood and Webb exchange a look that lasts a fraction too long. Standard geological surveys, Blackwood says. Any responsible development company conducts thorough site assessments before making acquisition offers. The lie hangs in the November air like fog. Thomas knows these men have specific knowledge about what lies beneath Harold's property, knowledge that goes beyond standard surveys. Someone has told them about the treasure, or they've been monitoring the property longer than they're admitting. I'll need to think about your offer, Thomas says, though he has no intention of considering it. Of course, Blackwood produces a business card with gold embossing, but don't think too long, Mr. Bennett. Market conditions change, and opportunities like this don't remain available indefinitely. There's a subtle threat in the words that makes Thomas's protective instincts flare. Is that some kind of warning? Simply business reality? Webb says with a cold smile, properties with complex issues tend to become more complex over time. Problems have a way of multiplying when they're not addressed promptly. After the men leave, Thomas immediately calls Dr. Harrison, who listens to the conversation account with growing concern. Thomas, you need to be very careful, Dr. Harrison warns. Blackwood Development has a reputation for getting what they want, and they don't always use legal methods. If they know about the treasure chamber, they have inside information from somewhere. That afternoon, Thomas drives to the county courthouse to research Blackwood Development Company's recent activities. What he discovers makes his blood run cold. Over the past 5 years, Blackwood has acquired more than a dozen properties in rural Nebraska, often after the original owners faced sudden financial crises, legal challenges, or personal tragedies that forced them to sell quickly and below market value. The pattern is consistent and suspicious. Properties that initially resist Blackwood's offers soon experience problems, environmental citations, tax assessment challenges, utility access issues, or zoning complications that make ownership difficult and expensive. Eventually, the stressed owners sell to Blackwood at reduced prices, grateful to escape their mounting problems. The courthouse records also reveal that Blackwood has been researching Harold's property for more than 2 years, filing information requests about mineral rights, historical designations, and subsurface surveys. They knew about the property's potential long before Harold died, and they've been positioning themselves to acquire it, regardless of Thomas's wishes. Thomas returns home that evening to find Emma and Jake waiting with news that chills him to the bone. "Daddy, some men came by while you were gone," Emma says, her 8-year-old face serious with worry. "They asked Mrs. Patterson if we were home alone very often." "Mrs. Patterson," Their elderly neighbor, who sometimes watches the children when Thomas has errands to run, had apparently been approached by men claiming to be from a child welfare organization. They'd asked detailed questions about Thomas's parenting, the children's care, and whether Emma and Jake seemed happy and well provided for. "What did Mrs. Patterson tell them?" Thomas asks, fighting to keep his voice calm. "She told them to mind their own business and get off her property," Jake says with satisfaction. "She said they were bothering good people and she'd call the sheriff if they came back." Thomas hugs both children close, his mind racing. The timing is too convenient to be coincidental. Hours after refusing Blackwood's offer, his fitness as a parent is being questioned by mysterious investigators. The implied threat is clear: sell the property or face challenges to his custody of Emma and Jake. That night, after the children are asleep, Thomas sits at the kitchen table with the Blackwood Development Company contract spread before him. The legal language is complex, but the implications are clear. Blackwood wants more than just the surface rights to Harold's property. They want complete ownership of everything above and below ground, with no restrictions on their use of whatever they find. Thomas realizes he's facing the same choice that confronted Harold and his ancestors, whether to protect something valuable and historically significant, or to surrender it to people who see only profit potential. The stakes are higher now because Emma and Jake's welfare is being threatened, but the moral equation remains the same. Sarah's recipe box sits on the counter, illuminated by the lamp's glow, reminding Thomas of the values she'd wanted him to preserve. Harold's brass key rests beside it, still warm from his handling earlier in the day. Both items represent the same message: some things are worth protecting regardless of the cost. Thomas makes his decision. Tomorrow, he'll contact Sheriff Martinez about the investigators who approached Mrs. Patterson, and he'll ask Dr. Harrison to expedite the historical preservation application for Harold's property. He'll also begin documenting everything he knows about Blackwood Development's tactics, building a case to protect not just his own family but other property owners who might face similar pressure. The November wind rattles the farmhouse windows, but Thomas no longer feels alone in his struggle. Harold's legacy has given him more than treasure. It's given him the resources and moral foundation to fight back against people who profit from other families' desperation. The battle ahead will be difficult, but for the first time since Sarah's death, Thomas feels like he's fighting for something larger than just survival. The discovery comes by accident on a cold December morning when Thomas is cleaning out the attic of Harold's farmhouse, preparing to make the building weather-tight for winter. Hidden beneath layers of old newspapers and moth-eaten blankets, he finds a wooden trunk that had been invisible from below. The trunk isn't locked, but its contents are protected by layers of oiled cloth that suggest someone took great care to preserve what lies inside. What Thomas finds changes everything he thought he understood about Sarah, Harold, and his own inheritance. Sarah's hidden journal lies at the top of the trunk, bound in brown leather, with her name embossed in gold lettering. Below it are documents, photographs, and correspondence that tell a story Thomas never knew existed. His hands tremble as he opens the journal to the first page, dated 3 years before Emma's birth. Thomas doesn't know about the family legacy yet, Sarah had written in her careful script. Uncle Harold and I agree that he needs more time to understand what kind of man he is before we burden him with this knowledge. But watching him work the farm, seeing how he treats the land and the animals, how he cares for our neighbors, I know we've chosen well. Thomas sits heavily on an old wooden chair, the journal open in his lap, as the full scope of what he's discovering begins to dawn on him. Sarah hadn't just known about the treasure chamber, she'd been actively involved in managing it. Page after page of the journal documents her regular visits to Harold's property, her participation in what she called the family business, and her careful planning for the day when Thomas would inherit both the property and its responsibilities. Harold and I authenticated another family heirloom today, one entry reads. The Washington's great-granddaughter finally tracked down our contact information through the genealogy website I set up. We were able to return her ancestors' Bible and the gold watch that had been in our care for 60 years. Seeing her face when she held her great-grandfather's Bible for the first time, that's why we do this work. Thomas flips through pages that reveal a side of Sarah he'd never suspected. While he'd been focused on daily farm operations, she'd been running what amounted to a historical preservation and family reunion service, using Harold's network and resources to reunite African-American families with ancestral treasures that had been preserved during their ancestors' flight to freedom. The journal entries span 8 years, from shortly after their marriage until just months before her cancer diagnosis. They document dozens of successful reunions, careful research into family genealogies, and the gradual expansion of the service to help families who'd lost track of their heritage during the great migrations of the 20th century. But the most shocking revelation comes in an entry dated just 6 months before Sarah's death. Thomas, if you're reading this, then I'm gone and Harold has passed away, and you've discovered what we've been protecting all these years. I know you'll be angry that I kept this secret, but I need you to understand why. The work we do here isn't just about preserving history, it's about fighting people who would destroy it for profit. Blackwood Development has been trying to acquire this property for 5 years. They don't want it for development, they want it because someone in their organization knows about the treasure chamber and wants to loot it. We've been gathering evidence of their illegal activities, their attempts to force families off valuable land, their connections to people who traffic in stolen historical artifacts. Richard Blackwood isn't just a developer, Thomas. He's the frontman for a network that specializes in acquiring properties with hidden historical value, stripping them of anything valuable and selling the artifacts to private collectors who don't care about their provenance. They've done this to at least a dozen families in Nebraska, Kansas, and Iowa. The worst part is how they operate. They research family tragedies, deaths, illnesses, financial crises, and then move in like vultures, offering cash to desperate people who don't realize what they're giving up. When families won't sell, Blackwood creates problems for them, legal challenges, bureaucratic obstacles, even personal threats. Harold and I have been building a case against them for 3 years, working with federal investigators who specialize in cultural property crimes. All of our evidence is in the trunk with this journal. When the time comes, you'll need to turn everything over to Agent Sarah Delacroix at the FBI's Art Crime Team. Her contact information is in the folder marked Federal Contacts. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you about this while I was alive, Thomas. The danger was too real, and I couldn't risk involving you until you had the legal protection that comes with owning the property. But I knew that when the time came, you'd do what's right. You always do. Thomas sits in the dusty attic for an hour, reading through documentation that reveals the full scope of Sarah and Harold's investigation into Blackwood Development. Financial records show connections to offshore accounts and shell companies. Correspondence with federal agents outlines a pattern of cultural property theft, stretching across multiple states. Photographs document meetings between Blackwood representatives and known dealers in stolen artifacts. The evidence Sarah and Harold assembled is comprehensive and damning. Blackwood Development is part of a sophisticated criminal network that has been systematically looting historical sites and exploiting vulnerable families for years. Thomas's inherited property isn't just valuable because of its treasure, it's the key to bringing down an entire criminal organization. Among the documents is a letter from FBI agent Sarah Delacroix, dated just weeks before Sarah's death. Mrs. Bennett, thank you for your continued cooperation in this investigation. The evidence you and Mr. Whitfield have provided has been invaluable in building our case against the Blackwood organization. As we discussed, timing will be crucial. We need to wait until the property transfer is complete and the new owner is legally protected before we move forward with arrests. Please assure your husband that the Bureau is committed to protecting his family during this process. Once he makes contact, we'll provide security measures to ensure his children's safety while we finalize the case against Blackwood and his associates. Thomas realizes that Sarah's death had interrupted more than just their family life. It had delayed a federal investigation that could expose a nationwide criminal conspiracy. His refusal to sell to Blackwood hasn't just protected Harold's legacy, it's kept crucial evidence out of criminal hands. The implications overwhelm him. Sarah hadn't just been his wife and partner, she'd been working undercover to protect families like his own from predators who profit from tragedy and desperation. Her recipe box, which he'd seen as a symbol of domestic warmth, had actually been a cover story that allowed her to travel freely between historical sites and affected families without arousing suspicion. As Thomas gathers the documents and prepares to leave the attic, he finds one final item that makes his throat tighten with emotion. It's a photograph of Sarah and Harold standing beside the stone well, both smiling with the satisfaction of people who know they're doing important work. On the back, Sarah had written a message in her familiar handwriting. "For Thomas, the man we knew would understand that some treasures are worth more than money. Thank you for being exactly who we thought you were. All my love, Sarah." Thomas drives home that afternoon with the trunk secured in his truck bed and a completely new understanding of his situation. The woman he'd mourned as a simple farm wife had actually been a sophisticated investigator working to protect historical treasures and vulnerable families. The uncle he'd barely known had been her partner in a mission that extended far beyond preserving Civil War artifacts. The pressure from Blackwood Development isn't just about acquiring valuable property, it's about eliminating evidence that could send dozens of people to federal prison. The threats to his family aren't business tactics, they're attempts to silence a witness who possesses information that could destroy a criminal empire. That evening, as Emma and Jake play with their toys in the living room, Thomas sits at the kitchen table with Agent Delacroix's contact information in front of him. Tomorrow, he'll make the call that Sarah and Harold had been working toward for years. Tonight, he allows himself to grieve not just for the wife he lost, but for the courageous woman he'd never fully known. Outside, December wind rattles the farmhouse windows, but Thomas feels a warmth spreading through his chest. Sarah's love for him extends beyond the grave, and her final gift isn't just financial security, it's the knowledge that she'd trusted him completely with the most important work of her life. The morning Thomas calls FBI agent Sarah Delacroix, winter has settled over Nebraska with the finality of a closing door. Snow covers the fields in pristine white, and the bare branches of the oak trees around Harold's farmhouse stand like sentinels against the grey December sky. Thomas makes the call from the warmth of his kitchen while Emma and Jake eat breakfast, their innocent chatter providing a soundtrack of normalcy to what he knows will be a life-changing conversation. Agent Delacroix answers on the second ring, her voice professionally warm but immediately alert when Thomas identifies himself. "Mr. Bennett, I've been expecting your call for months. I'm so sorry for your loss. Your wife was an extraordinary woman and an invaluable partner in this investigation." "I found her journal and all the documents yesterday," Thomas explains. "I had no idea she was involved in any of this. Sarah insisted on keeping you protected until the legal transfer was complete. She knew that once you inherited Harold's property, you'd become a target. But she also knew you'd be legally empowered to help us finish what she and Harold started." Agent Delacroix explains that the federal investigation into Blackwood Development has been building for 3 years, with Sarah and Harold serving as protected witnesses who documented criminal activities while appearing to be simple civilians interested in historical preservation. Their evidence has been crucial, but incomplete without the property transfer that would give law enforcement legal access to the treasure chamber and its contents. "We need you to understand the scope of what we're dealing with," Agent Delacroix continues. "Blackwood Development is the legitimate front for an organization that has systematically targeted rural properties with hidden historical value. They've stolen millions of dollars worth of artifacts, destroyed irreplaceable historical sites, and ruined dozens of families in the process. Thomas thinks about his conversation with the Blackwood representatives, their casual knowledge of his financial situation, their veiled threats about his children. They approached me last month, made an offer, and implied there would be consequences if I didn't accept. That's their standard operating procedure. They research vulnerable families' recent deaths, medical debt, financial stress, and time their approaches to maximize psychological pressure. If the initial offer is refused, they escalate to intimidation, bureaucratic harassment, and eventually direct threats. Agent Delacroix arranges to meet Thomas that afternoon at Harold's property, bringing with her a team of specialists who will document the treasure chamber's contents while ensuring the site's protection as a federal crime scene. She also assigns 2 agents to provide discreet security for Emma and Jake, a precaution that makes Thomas's stomach clench with worry even as he appreciates the necessity. Mr. Bennett, I want you to understand that once we begin this process, there's no going back. Blackwood will realize they've lost access to the artifacts, and they'll likely become desperate. We'll protect your family, but the next few days will be intense. Thomas spends the hour before the FBI team arrives, walking through Harold's property with new eyes, seeing it not just as a historical site or treasure repository, but as the focal point of a struggle between preservation and exploitation that has been going on for years. The stone well cover, with its intricate carvings, suddenly seems like a monument to the people who risked everything to protect what mattered most. Sheriff Martinez arrives first, his presence reassuring even though Thomas knows the local law enforcement is about to be overshadowed by federal agents. Sheriff Martinez has been a friend since Sarah's death, checking on the family and providing the kind of steady support that small communities offer their own. Thomas, Agent Delacroix, briefed me on the situation. Sheriff Martinez says, adjusting his badge, a gesture Thomas recognizes as the sheriff's way of preparing for serious business. I want you to know that my department is fully cooperating with the federal investigation. We've had our suspicions about Blackwood's activities for some time. The sheriff's badge gleams in the winter sunlight, representing law and justice in a way that suddenly feels deeply personal to Thomas. This isn't just about protecting his family anymore. It's about ensuring that other families don't face the same predatory tactics that have apparently been used against vulnerable property owners across the region. Agent Delacroix arrives with a team of 6 specialists: forensic accountants, art crime investigators, archaeological documentation experts, and security personnel. Thomas is struck by their professionalism and the obvious respect they show for both the historical site and the evidence Sarah and Harold had preserved. Mr. Bennett, before we begin the formal documentation process, I need to prepare you for what happens next, Agent Delacroix explains as they stand beside the stone. Well, based on the evidence your wife and Harold provided, we have warrants ready for the arrest of Richard Blackwood and 12 of his associates. However, we need to coordinate the timing carefully to prevent them from destroying evidence or fleeing. Thomas feels the weight of responsibility settling over him like a familiar coat. What do you need from me? We need you to act normally for the next 48 hours while we position our teams. Blackwood will likely contact you again, probably with increased pressure and more explicit threats. We need you to string them along, make them believe you're considering their offer while we finalize our preparations. The next 2 days pass with excruciating slowness. Thomas maintains his normal routine, taking the children to school, doing farm chores, caring for the animals, while knowing that federal agents are watching his every move and preparing for arrests that will make national news. The weight of carrying Sarah's secret, of understanding the true scope of what she and Harold had been working toward, makes every conversation feel loaded with meaning. Emma notices his distraction first, as she always does. "Daddy, you seem worried about something. Are we in trouble?" Thomas kneels to her level, looking into eyes that mirror Sarah's with painful accuracy. "No, sweetheart, we're not in trouble. But some people have been doing bad things, and we're helping the police make sure they can't hurt other families. Jake, overhearing, looks up from his toy tractors with 5-year-old seriousness. Like the bad guys in movies? Something like that. But the good guys are going to win, just like in the movies. On the second evening, Richard Blackwood calls Thomas's cell phone directly. His tone has shifted from polished salesmanship to barely controlled frustration. "Mr. Bennett, I think there's been a misunderstanding about our offer. We're prepared to increase our proposal to $4.5 million, but this is our final offer. Market conditions are changing rapidly, and we can't keep this opportunity open indefinitely." Following Agent Delacroix's instructions, Thomas responds with carefully scripted uncertainty. "I'm still considering your offer, Mr. Blackwood. $4.5 million is certainly attractive, but this is a big decision. I need a few more days to think it through. I'm afraid that's not possible." Blackwood's voice takes on an edge that makes Thomas's skin crawl. "We need an answer by tomorrow evening, or we'll have to pursue other options for acquiring the property." The threat hangs in the air like smoke from a distant fire. Thomas understands that other options likely means escalating to the kinds of pressure tactics that have apparently destroyed other families who stood in Blackwood's way. After the call ends, Thomas sits in his kitchen with Sarah's recipe box before him, thinking about the courage it must have taken for her to live with this knowledge for years while maintaining the facade of a simple farm wife. The recipes inside represent more than just family meals. They were part of the cover story that allowed her to travel freely, to meet with federal agents, to build the case that would eventually bring justice to families who had been exploited by predators like Blackwood. That night, Thomas calls Pete Morrison to ask a favor that feels both natural and momentous. "Pete, I need you to keep an eye on Emma and Jake tomorrow evening. Something's happening that I can't explain right now, but I want them somewhere safe until it's over." Pete, with the intuition that comes from decades of friendship, doesn't ask for details. "They can stay with us as long as needed. You take care of whatever you need to take care of." As Thomas prepares for bed, he catches sight of Harold's brass key on the dresser, gleaming in the lamplight. Tomorrow, that key will unlock more than just a treasure chamber. It will open the final chapter of a story that Sarah and Harold had been writing for years. A story about standing up to people who profit from others' desperation and protecting things that matter more than money. The December wind howls around the farmhouse, but Thomas feels a calm settling over him that he hasn't experienced since Sarah's death. Tomorrow will bring challenges and possibly danger, but it will also bring justice for his wife's memory and protection for families like his own. For the first time in months, Thomas falls asleep, feeling like he's not just surviving each day, but building something meaningful for the future. The final confrontation begins at sunset on a frigid December evening, when 3 black SUVs roll down the gravel road toward Harold's farmhouse. Thomas watches from the kitchen window as the vehicles park in a semicircle, their occupants remaining inside, with engines running a formation that suggests this visit isn't intended to be a friendly business negotiation. Agent Delacroix's voice crackles through the radio earpiece Thomas wears. "We have eyes on the target location. 6 individuals in the vehicles, 2 more approaching from the tree line to the east. Stay calm, Mr. Bennett. Everything is proceeding according to plan." Thomas's hands shake slightly as he checks the antique shotgun that Sheriff Martinez had retrieved from Harold's house earlier that day. The Civil War-era weapon, beautifully maintained despite its age, had belonged to Captain James Whitfield, the original Underground Railroad conductor. Sheriff Martinez had insisted Thomas know how to use it, though they both hoped it would remain a symbolic presence rather than a practical necessity. Richard Blackwood emerges from the lead SUV, his expensive overcoat incongruous against the backdrop of rural Nebraska winter. He's accompanied by Marcus Webb and 4 other men. Thomas doesn't recognize men whose bearing suggests military or security backgrounds. They approach the farmhouse with the confident stride of people who expect to get what they want. Thomas opens the front door before they can knock, the shotgun visible but not threatening in his hands. "Mr. Blackwood, this is an unexpected visit." Blackwood's smile has no warmth. "Mr. Bennett, I think we've moved beyond the need for polite conversation. You've had sufficient time to consider our offer, and frankly, your hesitation suggests you don't fully understand your situation." "My situation seems clear enough. You want to buy property I'm not interested in selling. What you call property, we call evidence." Webb interjects, his voice colder than the December wind. "Evidence that could complicate a lot of people's lives if it falls into the wrong hands." Thomas feels a chill that has nothing to do with the weather. These men know exactly what lies beneath Harold's property, and they're no longer pretending this is a legitimate business transaction. "I'm not sure what you mean by evidence," Thomas says, though his grip tightens on the shotgun. Blackwood steps closer, his breath visible in the cold air. "Mr. Bennett, we know about the chamber under the well. We know about the artifacts Harold preserved. And we know about the documentation your wife and that old man compiled. What you need to understand is that this information belongs to people who have worked very hard to keep certain business activities private." The admission hangs in the air like a challenge. Thomas realizes that Blackwood has abandoned any pretense of legitimacy. This is now an open attempt at intimidation and theft. "Harold left everything to me legally," Thomas says. "Whatever's on the property is mine by right of inheritance." "Legal ownership is a flexible concept," Webb says with a cold smile, "especially when the owner faces challenges that make it difficult to maintain their property. Challenges like child welfare investigations, tax audits, environmental citations, zoning violations, the kind of problems that can make life very complicated for a widowed father trying to raise two small children. The threat to Emma and Jake makes Thomas's vision narrow with anger. These men aren't just criminals, they're predators who target families at their most vulnerable moments. "Are you threatening my children?" "We're simply pointing out realities," Blackwood says. "Raising children alone is difficult under the best circumstances. When property ownership becomes complicated by legal challenges, when a father's judgment is questioned by social services, when financial pressures mount, well, sometimes the best solution is to accept help from people who can make problems disappear." Thomas raises the shotgun slightly, not pointing it at anyone, but making its presence unmistakable. "I think this conversation is over." "Actually, it's just beginning," Webb says, signaling to the men positioned around the property. "You see, Mr. Bennett, we've invested too much time and effort in this acquisition to accept no for an answer. One way or another, we're leaving here tonight with access to what Harold preserved." Through his earpiece, Thomas hears Agent Delacroix's voice. "Teams are in position. Maintain your current stance and let them make the first aggressive move." The standoff stretches for several seconds, the only sounds the wind through the bare oak trees and the idling engines of the SUVs. Thomas thinks about Sarah, about the courage it took for her to gather evidence against these predators while maintaining the facade of a simple farm wife. He thinks about Harold, spending decades protecting treasures that belonged to families who trusted him with their most precious possessions. Most of all, he thinks about Emma and Jake, safe at Pete Morrison's house, depending on him to ensure they inherit a world where bullies don't win simply because they're willing to use violence. "Mr. Bennett," Blackwood says, his patience clearly exhausted, "I'm going to count to 10. If you haven't invited us inside to discuss this matter rationally, we'll have to consider you an obstacle to legitimate business interests." 1. Thomas feels his heartbeat steady, the way it had during difficult moments throughout Sarah's illness, when he'd had to make hard decisions under pressure. 2. The antique shotgun feels solid and familiar in his hands, connecting him to generations of men who had faced down threats to protect what mattered most. 3. Agent Delacroix's voice in his earpiece. "Almost there, Mr. Bennett. Just a few more seconds." 4. Thomas thinks about the brass compass in his pocket, still pointing north toward freedom, toward the courage to do what's right, even when it's dangerous. 5. The moment stretches like a held breath, winter air sharp in Thomas's lungs, the weight of responsibility and legacy heavy on his shoulders. Before Blackwood can reach 6, the evening explodes into motion as federal agents emerge from concealment positions around the property, their weapons drawn and voices commanding immediate surrender. Floodlights illuminate the farmyard, turning the December dusk into blazing day, and the quiet of rural Nebraska shatters under the shouted orders of law enforcement professionals who have been waiting months for this moment. FBI, nobody move, hands where we can see them. The confrontation Thomas had been bracing for transforms instantly into a coordinated arrest operation that unfolds with the precision of a military exercise. Justice finally arriving for families who had been preyed upon by criminals who thought their money and connections made them untouchable. The arrest operation unfolds with stunning efficiency. Within minutes, Blackwood and his associates find themselves in handcuffs, their carefully planned intimidation session transformed into a federal crime scene, blazing with floodlights and swarming with agents. Thomas watches from the farmhouse porch as Agent Delacroix coordinates the operation, her voice calm and professional as she directs teams to secure evidence and process the suspects. Richard Blackwood, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit cultural property crimes, extortion, interstate transportation of stolen goods, and racketeering. Agent Delacroix announces as she approaches the man who had threatened Thomas's family just moments before. You have the right to remain silent. The Miranda rights echo across the winter landscape as other agents simultaneously arrest Blackwood's associates. The scene feels surreal to Thomas. These men who had seemed so powerful and threatening just minutes ago now appear ordinary and diminished in handcuffs, their expensive suits incongruous against the backdrop of federal law enforcement. Marcus Webb attempts to maintain his arrogance even in custody. You have no idea what you're interfering with, he shouts toward Agent Delacroix. The people we work for have connections you can't imagine. This arrest won't stick. Agent Delacroix approaches Webb with the federal marshal's warrant in her hand, the legal document that represents 3 years of careful investigation building toward this moment. Mr. Webb, this warrant is backed by evidence compiled by your victims over multiple years. Your organization's activities have been documented across 7 states, involving more than 40 separate criminal enterprises. This investigation has the support of federal prosecutors who specialize in organized crime, and frankly, your connections won't help you where you're going. As the suspects are loaded into federal transport vehicles, Agent Delacroix approaches Thomas with an expression of professional satisfaction mixed with personal relief. Mr. Bennett, I want you to know that tonight's arrests are just the beginning. Based on the evidence Sarah and Harold preserved, we have warrants for 23 additional suspects across multiple states. This organization has been dismantled, and the families they've victimized will finally see justice. Thomas feels a weight lifting from his shoulders that he hadn't fully realized he'd been carrying. What happens to the property now? To the treasure chamber? Everything proceeds according to the plan Sarah and Harold developed, Agent Delacroix explains. The historical artifacts will be properly catalogued and preserved, with priority given to reuniting items with descendants of their original owners. The financial assets will remain yours, minus any items that need to be returned to their rightful heirs. Based on our preliminary assessment, you're looking at approximately $38 million in personal assets, plus the historical site itself. The number staggers Thomas. Even after returns to rightful owners, the inheritance will secure Emma and Jake's future beyond anything he dared to imagine. But more importantly, it will allow him to continue the work Sarah and Harold had started, protecting historical treasures and helping families reconnect with their heritage. Sheriff Martinez approaches as the federal vehicles disappear into the winter night, their taillights fading like dying embers against the darkness. His badge catches the reflected light from the crime scene equipment being packed away, a symbol of local law enforcement's role in supporting justice, even when it extends far beyond county boundaries. Thomas, I wanted you to know how proud I am of what you've done tonight. Sheriff Martinez says, his voice carrying the weight of genuine respect. Standing up to those people took real courage, especially with Emma and Jake's welfare being threatened. I just did what Sarah would have wanted, Thomas replies, though he's beginning to understand that his role in tonight's events was more significant than simply honoring his wife's memory. No, you did more than that, Sheriff Martinez insists. You chose to trust the system, to work with law enforcement instead of trying to handle this alone. That decision probably saved lives and definitely prevented other families from being victimized. As the federal teams complete their work and begin departing, Agent Delacroix provides Thomas with a preliminary timeline for the legal proceedings ahead. Blackwood and his associates will face federal charges in multiple jurisdictions, with trials likely beginning within 6 months. Thomas will be needed as a witness, but his role will be primarily to authenticate the evidence Sarah and Harold had preserved, rather than to testify about criminal activities he hadn't directly observed. The beautiful thing about this case, Agent Delacroix explains, is that your wife and Harold documented everything so thoroughly that we don't need victims to relive their trauma in court. The paper trail they created tells the story more effectively than any testimony could. Before she leaves, Agent Delacroix hands Thomas a thick manila envelope containing copies of thank-you letters from families across the country, people who had been reunited with ancestral treasures through Sarah and Harold's work, families who had been helped during financial crises, individuals who had learned about their heritage through the genealogical research the two had conducted. Sarah asked me to give you these if anything happened to her, Agent Delacroix says. She wanted you to understand the scope of what you'd inherited, not just wealth, but a legacy of service that had touched hundreds of lives. Thomas opens the envelope that evening after returning home to Pete Morrison's house to collect Emma and Jake. The children are full of questions about the police lights they'd seen in the distance, but Thomas deflects their curiosity with promises to explain everything when they're older. Tonight, he wants them to focus on the simple joy of being safe and together. The letters Agent Delacroix provided tell stories that bring tears to Thomas's eyes. A woman in Detroit who had been reunited with her great-grandmother's wedding ring. A family in Chicago who had discovered their ancestor had been a conductor on the Underground Railroad, transforming their understanding of their own history. A man in Kansas City who had been able to prove his family's rightful ownership of land that had been fraudulently taken decades earlier. Each letter represents a victory against the kind of predatory exploitation that Blackwood's organization had represented. Sarah and Harold hadn't just been preserving artifacts, they'd been healing wounds that stretched back generations, helping families reclaim pieces of themselves that they'd thought were lost forever. As Thomas puts the children to bed in their own house, Emma asks the question he's been expecting. Daddy, are the bad men going to bother us anymore? Thomas tucks her covers around her with the same gentle care Sarah had always shown. No, sweetheart, the police caught all the bad men, and they can't hurt anyone anymore. We're safe now. Jake, already half asleep, mumbles from his bed, Are we still going to be poor? The innocence of the question breaks Thomas's heart and mends it simultaneously. No, buddy, we're not going to be poor anymore. In fact, we're going to be able to help other people who need help, just like Mummy used to do. That night, Thomas sits at the kitchen table with Sarah's recipe box open before him, reading through cards that he now understands represented more than just cooking instructions. Many of the recipes include notes in Sarah's handwriting that had seemed like simple observations about family preferences, but were actually coded references to the families she'd been helping. Add extra sweetness for the Washingtons wasn't about cooking. It was a reminder to be especially gentle with a family grieving their patriarch's death while trying to reclaim his Civil War medals. The brass key Harold had left him sits beside the recipe box, no longer mysterious, but symbolic of the access Thomas now has to continue work that spans generations. Tomorrow, he'll begin the process of establishing a foundation that will formalize the services Sarah and Harold had provided informally. The foundation will help families research their genealogies, reunite them with ancestral treasures, and provide financial assistance to people facing the kind of predatory pressure that Blackwood's organization had specialized in. Outside, the December wind has calmed, and snow begins to fall in fat, lazy flakes that soften the harsh edges of winter. Thomas watches the snow accumulate on the windowsill and thinks about the seasonal cycles that have defined farm life for generations. The dormancy of winter, giving way to the renewal of spring, the eternal promise that what appears dead will bloom again. For the first time since Sarah's death, Thomas feels that promise applying to his own life. The darkness of grief and financial stress that had defined the past year is giving way to something brighter, not the simple happiness of his early marriage, but the deeper satisfaction of carrying on meaningful work that honors both Sarah's memory and the historical legacy Harold had entrusted to his care. 6 months later, on a warm June morning that carries the promise of summer harvest, Thomas stands before the new farm sign that Pete Morrison helped him install at the entrance to what is now officially known as the Whitfield Bennett Historical Preserve. The sign reads, "Bennett Family Farm, Est, 2024," in elegant script. But below it, a bronze plaque explains the property's significance as a restored underground railroad station and genealogical research center. The transformation of Harold's property has exceeded even Thomas's optimistic expectations. The farmhouse, lovingly restored to its 1890s appearance, now serves as the headquarters for the Sarah Bennett Foundation for Family Heritage. The barn has been converted into a climate-controlled archive where historical documents and artifacts await reunion with descendant families. The treasure chamber beneath the stone well has become a museum exhibit that tells the story of the Underground Railroad through the preserved belongings of the brave souls who passed through this station. Emma and Jake race across the newly planted lawn, their laughter mixing with the songs of birds that have returned to nest in the oak trees surrounding the property. At 9 and 6 now, they understand more about their mother's secret work and take pride in their role as the next generation of guardians for this historical treasure. "Daddy, Mrs. Washington is here for her appointment," Emma calls, her voice carrying the responsible tone she's adopted since learning about the Foundation's mission. Mrs. Dorothy Washington, an elderly woman from St. Louis, has driven 4 hours to see the gold pocket watch that belonged to her great-great-grandfather, a conductor on the Underground Railroad who had worked with Harold's ancestor. The watch had been preserved in the treasure chamber for more than 80 years, waiting for the day when genealogical research could reunite it with his family. Thomas watches through the farmhouse window as Mrs. Washington holds her ancestor's watch for the first time, tears streaming down her face as she reads the inscription her family had only heard about in stories. These moments of reunion have become the most rewarding part of Thomas's new life. Validation that the risks Sarah and Harold took to preserve these treasures were worthwhile. Dr. Harrison arrives shortly after Mrs. Washington, bringing with him a team of graduate students who are documenting the site for the National Register of Historic Places. The Underground Railroad station will receive federal protection and recognition, ensuring that future generations can learn from its preserved history. "Thomas, I have wonderful news," Dr. Harrison says, his excitement evident even before he speaks. The Smithsonian wants to feature the site in their upcoming exhibition on the Underground Railroad. They're calling it one of the most significant archaeological discoveries related to the freedom movement in the past 50 years. The recognition means more than prestige. It will bring educational opportunities and funding that will allow the foundation to expand its services to families across the country. Thomas thinks about Sarah's journal entries, describing her dreams of helping more families reconnect with their heritage, and he knows she would be thrilled by the national attention the site is receiving. Pete Morrison stops by around noon, as he has every day since the foundation opened. His friendship has been crucial during the transition from struggling farmer to foundation director, and Thomas has come to rely on Pete's practical wisdom and steady support. "How's the new life treating you?" Pete asks, settling into a chair on the restored farmhouse porch. "Some days I still can't believe it's real," Thomas admits. "6 months ago, I was worrying about paying the electric bill. Now I'm managing a $40 million foundation and giving interviews to historical magazines. Sarah knew what she was doing when she trusted you with this," Pete observes. "Takes a special kind of person to inherit that much money and use it to help other people instead of just making life easier for himself." Thomas has indeed made his family's life easier. The Bennett farmhouse has been renovated. Emma and Jake have college funds that will allow them to pursue any dreams they develop, and the financial stress that had defined the year after Sarah's death has been replaced by the security of knowing they'll never want for anything essential. But the real transformation has been in purpose and meaning. Instead of simply surviving each day, Thomas now wakes up excited about the work ahead. Agent Delacroix visits that afternoon with updates on the federal trials that concluded the previous month. Richard Blackwood received a 20-year sentence for racketeering and cultural property crimes. Marcus Webb and 12 associates received sentences ranging from 8 to 15 years. More importantly, the investigation led to the recovery of millions of dollars worth of stolen artifacts that are being returned to rightful owners and museums. "The prosecutor told me this case has become a model for investigating cultural property crimes," Agent Delacroix reports. "Law enforcement agencies across the country are using the techniques Sarah and Harold developed to build cases against similar criminal organizations. The ripple effects of Sarah's undercover work continue to spread, bringing justice to families who had been victimized and protection to historical sites that might otherwise have been destroyed by development." Thomas feels a deep satisfaction, knowing that Sarah's courage has prevented other families from experiencing the kind of exploitation Blackwood's organization had specialized in. As evening approaches, Thomas walks through the property with Emma and Jake, a ritual that has become their way of connecting with the land and its history. They visit the restored stone well, now covered with protective glass that allows visitors to see into the chamber below. They check on the heritage garden, where plants mentioned in Underground Railroad correspondence are grown using 19th century techniques. They end at the memorial grove, where trees have been planted to honor the families who passed through this station on their journey to freedom. "Tell us the story again, Daddy," Jake requests as they sit beneath the oak trees that have witnessed more than a century of history. Thomas settles both children against his sides and begins the story that has become their family legend. How their mother and Uncle Harold worked in secret to protect treasures and help families. How they chose Thomas to continue their mission. How courage and integrity can triumph over greed and exploitation. "Mummy knew that sometimes the most important work happens quietly," Thomas explains, his voice carrying across the peaceful evening air. "She knew that helping one family at a time, preserving one piece of history at a time, would eventually add up to something bigger and more important than anything one person could do alone." Emma, now old enough to understand the full scope of her mother's sacrifice, asks the question that Thomas has been expecting. "Do you think Mummy can see what we're doing now?" Thomas looks up at the first stars, appearing in the darkening sky, and thinks about the legacy of courage and compassion that Sarah and Harold preserved for him to carry forward. "I think she can see it, and I think she's proud of how we're taking care of what she trusted us to protect." As they walk back toward the farmhouse, its windows glowing with warm light against the gathering darkness, Thomas feels a profound sense of completion. The man who had stood alone in his kitchen 6 months ago, overwhelmed by grief and debt, has been transformed into someone who can honor his wife's memory while building a meaningful future for their children. The brass key Harold left him now unlocks more than just treasure chambers. It opens doors to historical understanding, family reunification, and the kind of service that creates ripples of positive change across generations. Sarah's recipe box sits on the Foundation's archive shelf, its contents now understood as the careful documentation of a secret mission that spanned years and touched hundreds of lives. Tonight, Thomas will fall asleep in a house filled with the security of knowing that Emma and Jake will inherit more than financial wealth. They'll inherit the knowledge that their family stood for something important, that their mother's courage made a difference in the world, and that the legacy of protecting what matters most will continue through them to future generations. The Nebraska wind whispers through the oak trees that have sheltered this land through seasons of struggle and triumph, carrying with it the promise that some treasures are indeed worth more than money, and that the most valuable inheritance any family can receive is the knowledge that they have the power to make the world a better place for others.